And I'm very happy now to welcome 3 of the 4 of the commissioners of the inquiry with me now in our studio at CPAC. Marion is Chief Commissioner, and we're also joined by Commissioners Qajaq Robinson and Brian Eyolfson. And welcome to all 3 of you.
Thank you.
Good to see you here. Let me start with this, this use of the term genocide. It's something that Canadians typically associate with other countries, with things that have happened to other people, but you've placed it in front of Canadians today in connection with the findings of your inquiry. Tell me about the choice of that term genocide to decide what happened here and is still happening.
We started by looking at all of the evidence that we had heard and we had seen across Canada, and really evaluated how did we get here and what are we in the midst of here. And it was absolutely inescapable. The conclusion had to be genocide. But genocide isn't restricted rather to just what we see coming from Europe or elsewhere in the world where there are mass killings. Genocide can also be a chipping away, a constant grind on people. And it's not a Holocaust in the sense that we know, but it's generation by generation grinding away, grinding people down, stealing their spirits, stealing their identities, and in many cases stealing their homes from them and forcing them to relocate. It's losing children by force. It's losing the ability to have children by forced sterilization. It's by losing your sense of self-worth because of grinding poverty that's beyond your control. Commissioner Robinson has a great description of it.
Tell me about that, and in the context, if I can, of as the only non-Indigenous commissioner, what did you have to confront? What did you have to come to terms with in deciding, I'm looking at this evidence in front of me and that's what I conclude?
What became evident over time is that persistent, whether conscious, I think we all agree that the residential school policy was a conscious decision, and conscious decisions to assimilate, which I think we have to recognize actually means destruction, to destruct and destroy a culture, a society, the way they are together. Over time it became quite clear that those policies to assimilate, to remove Indigenous peoples from their lands, from their homes, from their families, from the ways in which they gather, collect, and establish laws, where they politically engage, that was deliberate. The historical records do not dispute that. But what that has led to is this slow death. We heard from so many families who talked about how the denial of their culture and identity and their place within society was the path to their being preyed on, either through sexual exploitation, by serial killers. It goes on. It was a difficult thing for me to accept as a non-Indigenous woman. But I'm a lawyer. I know the law. I know international law. I know domestic law. I know what we're dealing with. And I could not unsee it and unknow it. And I can't fail to call it what it is.
Commissioner Eyolfson, I mean, so for people who may be uneasy with the use of this term, and I guess that's what one of the things you wonder about, if you want to move this conversation forward, are some people immediately putting up a stop sign to their own openness by saying, what, genocide? I don't think I like the sound of that. What's the message to those people?
Well, I think it's really important that they educate themselves about these issues if they're not aware of it, because what we heard in the hearings was a great deal about violence and how that violence was rooted in colonialism. So there's this ongoing pattern of colonial violence that's been going on for a couple hundred years, and it's expressed, through different means, such as my colleagues mentioned, residential schools that impacted on the physical health and greatly on the mental health of the students. We've heard about things like the 60 Scoop and the child welfare system, taking children away from their families, communities, and their cultures and placing them with other cultures. So these are the sorts of things that give rise to our finding of genocide. But I think what's most important is where do we go from here? I mean, it's the recommendations that flow from that.
I find that's interesting. History teaches us that cultures, governments, peoples involved in genocides aren't typically the ones called upon to try and fix the problem that they created. But that's what you're asking here. You're asking people in this country to step up and deal with what's been done in the past. What are your expectations?
I'm hoping that people will keep an open mind, will learn, will read our report as well, but also to understand that this goes to basic human and Indigenous rights that are being violated and have been violated, and that it's time for us to move forward to understand that we have work to do, but we're going to do it together. We're going to learn together, we're going to find solutions together, and we're going to move forward together and make this a great country.
The Prime Minister in his remarks today, Commissioner Robinson, didn't use the term genocide, even though some people in the audience called it out. He didn't use it. Should he have used it? And if he's not using it, does that concern you about how he'll address, or what his plan will be to address the problem if he's refusing to acknowledge one of the key findings of the inquiry?
It does concern me. We need to call it what it is and then mount an action that matches what it is. So it does concern me that if you're not going to call what is happening genocide, it worries me that the response might not match. That said, I think that he's indicated that they are going to continue to reflect, and I hope that he comes to understand what it is we're talking about here.
What about you, Commissioner Eyolfson? Are you concerned that if the Prime Minister won't use the term, that is a difficult place to start the process of improvement from?
Well, again, I mean, the report was just delivered today. It's over 1,200 pages long.
You think he might eventually use it?
Well,
or should he?
I'm hopeful that what's most important for me is that they take the recommendations seriously and they act on the recommendations. And it's just not only government. I think there's a role for all Canadians to play in this, right? I hope that this inquiry has drawn enough attention to the issues that a lot more Canadians are aware of these issues, and that there will be more political will going forward to make these necessary changes.
Let's follow up on that. I'm one of those non-Indigenous Canadians. You had a message for me today, and others. Decolonize yourself. What does that mean? What do I do?
Well, the first thing you do is you ask, what do I do? That's the first step. Then the next step is to have an open mind, to be open to new ideas, to be open to education, because education is critical to understand the real history of Canada. Those of us who have been in the Canadian public school system have not learned the real Canadian history. It's only been recently that the residential schools legacy has been taught in the schools. So there's so many of us, myself included, who weren't taught the real history of Canada. So keep an open mind, educate, and reach out and hold government accountable.
And one of the main things you said today was, I mean, this is the report. This is you're asking Canadians to do some heavy lifting here. That if you want to be part of the conversation and informed in the conversation, take some time to look at this, right?
There's a number of things you can do in addition to that, and one of the things that, for me personally, as a non-Indigenous person in my role and engaged in this process, one of the things that I had to start doing very actively was challenging my assumptions. Why do we do things? Why do we do things the way we do things? What's the root of it? You know, we look at certain pieces of law, things we take for granted. And now we have to stop and think, okay, what I take for granted and I want understand to be true, is that off the backs of other people? That engagement, thought and reflection in yourself. And then it's also about building relationships. I've learned so much from my colleagues, so much, and they've called me out when my assumptions are rooted in places they shouldn't be. And that's sometimes a tough place to be, but develop those relationships so you can do that personal homework too.
Commissioner Eyolfson, the report doesn't answer the question of what happened to many of these women specifically, in terms of, there were many parents, I think, and families and loved ones who thought they would get answers to their particular cases of what happened to their loved one. Will they ever get those answers?
Well, first of all, our mandate, of course, was to look at systemic issues, right. And we've identified numerous systemic issues that contribute to the violence that Indigenous women and girls experience. But some of our recommendations, for example, in our interim report, we recommended to government that they set up a task force to look at unsolved cases, and I don't believe they've responded to that yet. But there are other recommendations in our report around policing and police oversight and how to improve the investigations of missing loved ones.
Let's talk about the police piece and all of this. As what I was able to glean, I admit I'm one of the people who hasn't gotten around to reading the whole thing yet, but I will. The role of the police in all of this in different forces was uneven. Is that a fair way to put it, in terms of cooperation with the process, providing information, a willingness to participate and search for answers? Is that a fair characterization of the role of police, and what needs to change? What's the number one thing that needs to change about the way police take on these cases?
Well, I think you made a fair characterization of police forces or police services cooperation with us in the course of our inquiry. Some have been wonderfully cooperative, and others have been less so. Including
the National Police Force?
Yes. What's the number one thing that police officers, police forces can do is to do some self-examination. About how they treat Indigenous people, Indigenous women and girls, to us LGBTQIA people in every step of their investigation.
I did. Did you want to jump in? Right.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I think what we heard so much about during our hearings was the problematic relationship between police services and Indigenous peoples and communities. So I think one thing that's key is for police services to work on that relationship building with their local communities, the Indigenous communities that they're serving.
In just a moment, we're going to hear from, I think it's important for our viewers to not only talk about where we go from here, but I think to remind them of some of the things you did here. Not a lot, but a couple of minutes worth coming up. We can't put all of those hearings back on. We carried them all online through the whole process, but and they will note when they see this in a few moments that there's almost every single person that I remember watching and hearing from, almost to a person, talked about how things never went very well with investigators when the process started, right?
I'll speak to, just to build on what my colleagues have raised. In addition to what we heard from families, through our forensic review of police files, we noted issues with quality of policing because of lack of resources, particularly in isolated communities. We found a pattern of dismissive attitudes towards cases involving Indigenous women, relying on assumptions rather than investigating actual facts in drawing conclusions, making assumptions that, well, she was, Indigenous girl, she must have been out partying. These are some of the patterns.
On her 18th birthday, she's probably gone on a bender, and so she'll show up.
Those were within the police documents themselves noted, and as well as what we heard from families. So that dismissiveness, rooted in race and gender-based bias, needs to be confronted within the RCMP and all police forces.
And if you saw that in this process, which is the most detailed, the most extensive process of its kind to look at this kind of what happened here. If you didn't find particularly willing partners in some areas of law enforcement / the RCMP, what's the likelihood you could make them change? I mean, how do you get at that?
Well, I think our calls for justice are going to already make them stop and think about how they're doing business, for lack of better words. They have to change. The spotlight's on them. The truth is out there about how Indigenous women and girls, 2S people, are treated. You can't unhear that truth, and they have to act.
Anything to add on that in terms of?
Well, if I could add, I think leadership is key, right? And in terms of directing the police force in terms of recruiting, training, and various policies and practices. So I think it has to start with leadership as well.
A couple of quick questions, Dan. We have an election campaign. You know, we might be in it already, but it officially kicks off in not too long from now. What are your expectations of political parties in response to this report? What do you feel they're obligated to do, to say, to stand for?
Well, I think they're obligated to develop a platform that includes the implementation of our calls for justice, because these aren't recommendations or mere suggestions. They're legal imperatives, they're legal obligations that the Canadian state has to meet based on human rights and Indigenous rights that Canada has signed on to protect.
Let me finish on this and start with you, if I can, Commissioner Robinson. We almost 3 years of this experience. I know the kind of testimony you heard because we carried it here on CPAC. Heart-wrenching. It's not something you leave behind. Just because we're about to approach a date on the calendar that says your work is finished, it doesn't mean you leave that work behind and those experiences behind. Let me ask it this way. How has what you've done changed the way you view your country?
Oh, tough question. How I view our country. I have a lot of faith in people. I have a lot of faith in what we can do when we come into relationships in an honest way, respectful way. I think that I see our country as people in relationships now and understand the importance of relationship more than I ever did before. You know, you grow up and school teaches you how to pursue a career, pursue economic independence, and these are all very good things. But what I've learned is the importance of my relationships with people, my relationship with you, how I communicate with you, and where my intentions come from. And I think that that is from what I've learned is quite a consistent teaching within Indigenous communities. I'm not going to pan-indigenize, but many, many testimonies from across the country emphasize that importance of relationship. And relationship speaks to accountability and makes us responsible for each other as well as ourselves. And I see myself differently within this country now. And I also see what we can do collectively differently now.
Commissioner Eyolfson?
I think for me it's really highlighted a sort of disconnect between the lives of, you know, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country. And I think what it's highlighted is that we have a lot of work to do. But I think my colleague Commissioner Robinson has really touched on what's important, that's relationship building. And I think that's key to moving forward.
Chief Commissioner, we'll give the final word to you.
I have to echo what my colleagues have said, the importance of relationship building, relationships that are respectful, that are kind, that are honest. That's what I've learned, and that's how we're going to have to move forward.
Thank you all for your work, and thank you all for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.